All right, folks, we're going to go ahead and get started with breakout session number 2. So thank you for coming to this breakout session. This is the breakout session Data is the Story. My name is Betsy Armington, and I'm the Regional Partnership Coordinator for Region 3 that encompasses 14 counties in southwest Iowa, and I will be one of your moderators for this session. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. There will be time for questions at the end of the presentation, and our speakers will do their best to repeat the question before they answer it in case you can't hear it. The session will be recorded and later shared throughout our partner network, so keep an eye on your email and our website for that information. And please don't forget to complete your partner survey if you haven't had the chance already. After this session, we will be having a milk and cookies break, and that would be a great opportunity to finish that up and turn it in if you haven't done so. Now I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Trace Hoekstra. Trace and the team at Kitchen Sink Communications deliver grant strategy and proposal development for nonprofits with budgets ranging from $250,000 to more than $25 million. Since 2020, they have secured $60 million in grant funding for community development and human services projects. Like many grant professionals, Trace didn't enter the field by design. She earned the opportunity to write her first proposal in the early 2000s because she had the single required credential, being willing to try. Over the years, she added to that skill set through a combination of formal training, experience, and failures, earning her Grant Professional Certified credential from the Grant Professional Certification Institute in 2019. Today, Trace guides diverse clients focused on broad community issues, including food assistance, affordable housing, refugee services, beginning farmers, children's mental health, juvenile justice, workforce development, conservation, and much more. Each year, she and her colleagues write hundreds of requests for general operating, programming, capacity building, and capital projects to foundation, corporate, and government funding. Please help me welcome Trace.
Hi, how are you guys? Good. We're going to see how this works. I kind of like to walk around, so we'll see if I can make that happen. That was a much longer introduction reading than it looked like on paper. So thanks for having me today. We're going to spend some time talking about, it's already walking away from it. Okay. Is it okay? Okay. Tell me if it's too far away or too close. I'll try and figure it out. So we're going to spend some time today talking about data and storytelling. My background is grants, and so that's the lens that I use to look at this, but we're not actually going to spend a ton of time on grants themselves. We're going to talk about data, how to use it, and you can apply that to grants. Everything that we talk about today is applicable to grants because grants are about describing what you do, okay? So if you're doing it and we're talking about the data, yes, it's applicable to grants, but it's also applicable to everything else you do. So I use data every day in my work, and it's essential to what we do, but it's essential because it's a reflection of what my clients do. It helps them do every piece of their work better. It's a powerful ally for organizations who can learn to use data to their advantage. How many in here like data? Use data like. How many in here hate data? Wow, usually there are more haters. So before we get started, I want to just ask you a few things about what you do with the food bank. And I know you're all partners, so some of these answers are going to be similar. We're just going to shout them out. So what are some of the data pieces that you are required to collect in order to be a partner? The things you have to do and report back to the food bank. Monthly stats, including what?
Number of households, if you do on-site meals, number of individuals, and then break it down into age brackets.
Okay, households, on-site meals, number of individuals broken down into age brackets.
Rescue food.
Rescue food, and what do you report about rescue food?
How many pounds we got from each of our stores.
Okay, so how many pounds you collected from the stores in your local area?
Yep.
Okay, What else? Anything else? Volunteer hours that are needed. Say it one more time. Volunteer hours for grant writing. Okay. Anything else? Yeah.
New households that had not accessed before.
Okay.
Individuals that had not gotten this before.
Okay, so new individuals that haven't accessed food through your specific location before. Anything else?
Dollars spent for, depending on what we spend it on, like, is it for actual food procurement or to store things in somebody's place if we can't use it right away?
Okay, so how you spend your funds, how much of your funds are spent on procurement, getting the food that you need to deliver, and how much are spent on other things that support that work, supportive efforts. How do you collect those things? What do you do? What are some of the things that you do to collect that data? Spreadsheets. Surveys. When do you collect it? At the time of visit? How often? Every single time? Some yeses and some nos. Where do you record it? Spreadsheet, are there other places? Other places. On it, okay, paper. Yep, so paper for a lot of you, recipe cards and old recipe box, right? So do you use volunteers to gather that information, or do you use staff? One person uses you. Are you a single person shop?
My husband and I are the duo.
So everything is you. Congratulations. So when we think about how we collect that data, usually I think of several things. I think of who collects it, how often you collect it, by what method do you collect it? Are you doing surveys? Are you talking to somebody? Where do you record it? And how do you report it? How do you kind of aggregate it together into a final piece of data that reflects the work that you're doing at your program? Those things that you're required, we're still talking about what's required for the food bank. Those things that are required for you to report back to the food bank, how do you use those pieces of information, aside from using them to fill out a report?
Comparisons,
Comparisons to what?
like what we did this month compared to what we did in April,
Okay.
what we did a year ago,
And comparisons on those, like pounds delivered.
how many people we helped serve, like, let's say, last month compared to a year ago.
Okay, so year over year, month over month service numbers. What else? Did you have something?
Just kind of those requests to, meet with the Rotary, meet with the Lions for that presentation-ish stuff.
Okay, she said meet with the Rotary, do presentation type things. You use that data to share with the community what you're doing. Okay, what else? To acquire funding, so to seek resources, and it's, I always say funding because I'm in grants, but what I really mean by funding is resources. I mean volunteer hours, I mean cash dollars, I mean in-kind donations. So yes, so you use that to seek funding, and why? How does it help you seek funding?
When you do the presentations to the Rotary Club, you can utilize those to say, we're serving so much more, here's the data, and then we really need your support as a community to come back and help provide this much, or, as we increase, we're gonna need support, a continuing support cycle.
Awesome. Anything else?
We use the numbers to help with ordering, so to know how much product we need.
Fantastic. So you're using it in an operational way, in a predictive way, to help you make decisions about what you're going to do in your operations going forward. Awesome. So those are questions that I want you to keep in mind as we go through our conversation today. What do you collect? How do you collect it? What does it tell you? And how do you use it? Those 4 questions. We're going to translate those into shorthand of what do you collect? Metric. What's the metric? How do you collect it? What are the methods? What does it tell you? Analysis. And what do you do about it? Application. Okay? Metrics, methods, analysis, application. You're going to hear those a few times today. Oh, I forgot to say at the top, by the way, if you have questions, let them fly, because I would much rather tell you what you want to know than tell you what I think you want to know, if that makes sense. All right, so just to get an idea of what's happening with people around you, I'm going to ask you to do, let me see, I got to figure this out. Yay. I'm going to ask you to have a conversation with your neighbor. So if you aren't super close to somebody, somebody within talking distance, feel free to scoot your chairs. We don't have to be all formal. Groups of 2 or 3 will be fine for this, so turn around backwards. Whatever you need to do to have 1 or 2 people to share with. I want you to, this time, with a partner, talk about data that you collect that is not required. At least 1 piece of data that you collect that is not required to report to the food bank, okay? I want you to think, what's the metric? What's the method? How do we collect it? What's the analysis? What does it tell us? And application, what do we do? Okay? I'm gonna give you 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes to just chat. Do you want to move? You good? You don't want to move. Okay, you stay. Are you from Australia? Yeah. Her back is hurt, so she can't. Don't want to hurt. I don't want to hurt you. Okay. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to give you about 15 more seconds to wrap it up.
Sometimes they put in 2, 3 seconds or whatever.
Okay, go ahead and bring your attention back up here if you would. You don't need to turn your chairs back or move back because we're going to have one more conversation where you are in just a moment. Before we do that, Is there somebody who's willing to give an example of what they shared with a partner? Go ahead.
Well, at our pantry, we have a menu, so when our clients come in, or our neighbors, they pick what they want. I give them the quantity that they're allowed, and then they pick what they want, and they sign it and do all the stuff that I need to for the food bank, but, we keep those, and we don't have to. I just do because it's nice to know what's what's popular, what people are picking, and that way I know when to order. Oh, I don't want to order that because nobody really cares, or it's on my shelf, so.
Okay, perfect example. So they have a menu, if you couldn't hear, they have a menu, and they track which things, the client choice essentially, which things are popular. They're not required to do that for the food bank, but it helps them understand what to reorder and what not to reorder if there are things that are taking up space on your shelves that people aren't taking home, right? Anybody else got an example?
We ask for phone numbers because there are times that come up that we need to contact somebody, and so even though phone numbers aren't required, it just helps us.
Okay, so you collect phone numbers.
Sometimes they leave something after they picked it up, it's like, hello, you forgot your, we'll be right back.
Okay, so you collect phone numbers, and I'm going to say this, tell me if this is accurate. You effectively use them as a customer service tool, as a relationship tool, not because you're soliciting anything or you're calling them up to chat, but because if you need to share information, that's a way you can do it. So again, an operational decision. Anybody else? Sure.
We kind of collect data, which seems a little biased to me, but we collect data, my husband does, on family member size and like what ethnicity they are. And we try to get a little, because of the relationship we have with a lot of the families, we try to get a little information on like how long they've been doing this, why, how do they get out of, how can we get them out of this cycle? Because we have like, I was just telling you, probably 15 to 20% of the family members that come are like 3 generations in a house. And the grandma will say, I've been doing this for 50 years. And I mean, like, what the noon presenter talked about is your kids model what they know. So how do we get the kids to go beyond that and say, it doesn't have to be like this?
Okay, so in case you couldn't hear, I'm going to paraphrase. They shared that at their pantry, they collect information about clients' household size, about race and ethnicity when it's possible, and about other circumstances, including how long they've needed food assistance. And you gave some other examples too.
And that's pretty much it. We did have the positive of this in the last 4 years that we've done it. We had one family that had like a generational thing where the grandparents had been going, the parents had been going, and the children. And we found out as to one of the parents passing away from COVID, that they no longer needed to come to the pantry. And how we found that out was like 2 months later, and it kind of surprised us because the parents and the grandparents were farmers, and they sold the farm, and since that time, they were always coming to the pantry, right? And the kids, we were thinking, oh, the kids are like 10 and 12 and 13, and they're seeing their grandparents are needing food to come to the pantry. Well, then we come to find out that the parents were heavy into gambling, and so that's where all their income was going, and the kids didn't really realize the connection as to why they were going to the pantry to get food when it looked like they were doing okay.
Okay. So success, it lets you know when you have success. Is that fair?
Grandparents, came back and told us, well, they don't need to come anymore now.
Oh, that always feels good. That's amazing. So data collection and analysis application is tricky for any organization. I would tell you that it's especially tricky for nonprofits, that it's especially tricky for small nonprofits, and that it's especially tricky for small nonprofits that use a lot of volunteer help. Okay? I'm guessing that's a lot of people in this room are covered under at least one of those categories. There's a lot of reasons why it's tricky. I think some of the key things are that you have to have buy-in. Your leadership and your team have to believe that data collection is going to result in positive change for your organization in some way. They have to feel like it isn't busy work. It's hard because it has to be a coordinated effort, and especially when you have a lot of volunteers, that's a lot of people who have to know what to do, know how to do it, and do it consistently time after time to make sure that you get good data. You're not just collecting data, but you have usable data. And I think probably most importantly, it takes your resources. It takes your time. It takes your money. It takes your brain power. It takes your resources. So as a small organization, you have to make a decision between using money that's in your hand to directly address your mission right now, to buy a meal, or to use that money for staffing time or spreadsheets or whatever it is that you do to track your data, with the idea that long-term, the benefit is going to be bigger than buying the one meal today. You have to be in a position to be able to do that, to use data effectively, right? You have to have that capacity. You have to have your eye on the long game to be able to do it. Otherwise, you're collecting data probably for the food bank that you're required to by Feeding America and passing it on and not doing a lot with it internally. Oops, I hope that's not me. That's my morning wake up. So one of the things we're going to talk about today is that I think the data that you collect and how you use it and the stories that you tell with it are fundamentally important to the job that you're doing. They're fundamentally important to your ability to achieve your mission or to make progress towards your mission. So to harness data power, I think the first step is to kind of think about data itself. What's data? Could be numbers. Information. Good, yeah. So I'd say it doesn't have to be, it can be numbers, it doesn't have to be numbers. It could be feedback from a client, right? That's information. For every piece of data that you collect, unless you're just doing it to write a report for somebody else, I think you should be able to answer 4 questions. We talked about these a little bit already. What are you collecting? Metric. How are you collecting it? Methods. How will you evaluate it? Analysis. And what are you going to do with it? Application. These questions are the overlay for all useful data for your organization. And the answers will be different to those questions for every single piece of data or for the same piece of data among different organizations. If you can't answer these questions about a piece of data, then I think it's fair that you're asking yourself why you're collecting it. Right? You can collect data about how many people come into your pantry wearing green shirts. You can compare that to the number of people who come in red shirts. But if you can't use it, why are you collecting it? If you can't use it or you don't use it, why are you collecting it? So if you go through and you can answer those 4 questions about pieces of data, then I think you have what I would call useful data. Not just data, but useful data. Okay? So we think about it as information collected. We know the questions that we're going to ask ourselves about it, and we're going to add to that definition information collected for reference or analysis. Shorthand, useful data. I'm going to give you a quick example. So we're going to just keep this very simple. An agency wants to know how many pounds they handle each year. What's the metric? Pounds handled, pounds that come in their door, right? What do you think their method is for that specific thing, pounds handled? Weight, okay. So the scale's part of it. What else? A spreadsheet, some method of recording, right? And the person to do the work. How about evaluation and analysis? What will that information tell you? How many pounds you handle in a year? What does that tell you?
How many people will need to move that kind of product?
Okay, so it could give you information about staffing needs. What else? Storage information. Anything else? Okay, potentially how many mouths you've fed. That would take it one step further, right, to knowing how those pounds were distributed, not just how you handled them, but how they were distributed.
How much is left at the end of the year, distribution?
How much is left at the end of the year from distribution. So when you start thinking about analysis, the first year that you create or that you track a new piece of data, you may just be looking for the status. You're just trying to figure out where are you right now in this year. You don't really have anything to compare it to. You might have an idea, but usually it's a guess, right? If you're tracking new data on a grant application and they ask you, it's like, how are we going to do this? And program people are always, I don't know how many people we're going to serve because we're not doing it yet. So you have to make that wild guess if you're not already tracking information. But then in future years, I think that analysis involves two things. It involves a comparison, either against a goal or an objective, or a comparison against what you did in a prior year or month, year over year, which gives you trend line data that can show you generally how your organization is doing. Are you doing more each year? Are you doing less each year? What does that look like? But more importantly, once you have that information, how are you going to assess why it is the way it is? That's the second part of that analysis piece. It's comparing the information against some kind of benchmark, prior year or goal. But it's also then looking at the answer to that and saying, why did that happen? Right? COVID gave us perfect examples of this, unfortunately. Some people in 2020, some organizations delivered way more food than they delivered before. When they're looking at their data, they can guess or hypothesize that the reason that they delivered way more was because need was higher. More people in their community needed help. Maybe there was more government commodities. Maybe you had different access to food sources. Maybe you had volunteers that you didn't have before. There could be many reasons why that happened the way it happened. A similar organization might look at their 2020 data and see their numbers actually went down. Why would their numbers go down when need is so high? Well, if you're a congregate meal site, you were shuttered, right? You weren't allowed to do your work. So you can look at that, and COVID is a really clear example of it, but that's an example of what you want to do once you have that data, is think about why is it the way it is? And then last, your application piece, which is how do you look at that data and apply it to the work that you do in a meaningful way. The questions that I think are most appropriate in that regard are things like, how does that metric, the analysis of the metric, allow us to do something better or different? How does it allow us to measure progress? How does it allow us to share our story with the community? And how does it allow us to access resources? So the takeaway from that is do look at the data that you're collecting, both the required data and the extra data, and see if you have an answer to each of the questions that we talked about. If you don't have an answer, see if you can find one, and if you can't find one, you might as well be collecting data about green shirts. Don't waste your time, okay? Not all data is useful data. Yeah. Oh, yes.
Data. Our agency was dropped a bombshell a year and a half ago.
Okay.
Our food pantry was in a building where two ladies owned it. They provided all the funding for us to be there, basically. They charged us minimal $100 a month rent. They paid all utilities, which was like 3 or 4 times that much, and made the mortgage payments on the building. They bought it basically for the food pantry. The bombshell to us was, we're selling your building. Where does that let us be? Where does that make us go? The data that was collected, we took to basically a core group of people saying, this is what we need, this is who we serve, and everything. So then another core group of people got together and fundraised $80,000 in 6 weeks, a very small community.
Could you hear that? $8,000 in 6 weeks after they were going to lose their building unexpectedly.
So we purchased the building, let the city buy it for $1, so it's on their expense now. And we get the use of it.
So the data of who you helped and the impact that you had let you, when something unexpected happened, let you share your story and raise funds so that you could continue to do good work.
Right.
Thank you for taking care of my next slide. So I think it's helpful to have kind of a shared way to think as we're talking today. How am I on time, Neil? We're 20 minutes? Good. Okay. I think it's helpful to have a shared way to think about programming. So when I think about programming at the most basic level, sustainable programming, it's got these 4 things. Do good work, document impact, share outcomes, and fund good work. If any one of those fails, you're stuck. So the story you just shared started with documenting impact, sharing that impact of what you did with the community when you had trouble, funding good work as a result of the impact that you were able to share, and then being able to do more good work, which in turn allows you to document impact, okay? If any one of those breaks down, your program is not sustainable, okay? If you get funding and you do some great work and you document impact, but you don't share it with the community, how are you getting more funding? You're not. If you share great outcomes and you get funding, but then you do a really sloppy job on your work, are those funders coming back to you? No, because you can't document the same amount of impact, and so you can't share the outcomes that lead to that funding. So when I think about a sustainable ecosystem, this is how I think about it. It can be really complex, and when you get these slides afterwards, there's some citations at the end. If you want more detail, you can look at them. But for me, this is the simplest level. You can go deeper and deeper. You can have encyclopedias of detail talking about all kinds of things that influence this, but you can't go shallower. right? You have to do these 4 things to have a sustainable program. Each of these things is a way to start a program, it's a way to sustain a program, and it's a way to potentially have a program failure. They all have to work together. They're all pushing that wheel. For me, when I think about those core drivers in a healthy ecosystem, I think about data as providing energy to each of those pieces. The data that you have provides energy to each of those pieces, which in turn keeps that ecosystem spinning in a way that sustains your programming and allows you to have impact and hopefully growth. When I think about that for good work, what do I think about with data for good work? I think about you making changes that make what you do better, more efficient, any of those things, making decisions based on data. When I think about documenting impact, I think about, are you asking the right questions? Are you asking them in a right way? Are you being consistent? Because if everybody's asking a little different question, then your data is not very helpful. Okay? An example of that, just to go back to what we were talking about, we talked a few minutes ago about, in the previous example, about pounds that you handled. Pounds that you handle is not the same as food that you deliver, right? So if I had given you that example before and said we want to find out how much food we deliver, we have to do more than just weigh it. We either have to weigh how much we give people or we have to weigh how much is wasted to get where we need to go. So documenting impact is asking the right questions. Okay? Sharing outcomes, data helps you establish the value of your work in the community. It lets you tell the community why what you're doing is critical, why it's essential. Not why it helps one person, although the story that it does is really important and helpful and connects with people. But if somebody wants to help one person, they're going to give money to the person, right? So for you, it has to be about that one person being reflective of the change that you're making in society, right? A societal need that you're addressing. So data allows you to share those outcomes in a way that establishes that value. What did I miss? Funding. Oh, just what I do every day, that's okay. So funding good work, how does data help there? The difference with funding good work is I am trying to motivate somebody to do something. I am trying to use data to make them act, to understand how they can help, and to encourage them to help. Okay? So it may be very similar data as what I'm using when I share outcomes, but usually it has a different slant because it's about what you can do or how much a specific thing that you do will impact outcomes for people in our community. There are lots of other factors other than data that can help speed these up and slow them down, and those are in more detailed models. Culture, organization culture, governance, administration, partnership. Those kind of things are all part of this puzzle as well. So here's the takeaway. To create a sustainable program, you gotta do good work. You gotta document impact. You have to share outcomes, and you have to fund good work. Know that data provides essential energy for each of those drivers by supporting incremental improvement in your operations, by helping you share what you're doing with the community, by raising the resources, and again, I used funds, but resources that you need to do the work that you do. And it helps you measure progress and see change over time. So do those things, and don't mistake collecting a lot of data for using data to advance your mission. They're two different things. Okay? We're going to focus in on two areas of the ecosystem, talking about storytelling now, where data supports storytelling. And for me, that's sharing outcomes and funding good work. The resource I use most often to talk about this is a book that you can pick up in any bookstore called Made to Stick. Has anybody read Made to Stick? Made to Stick. Okay? It's a great book. It's an easy read if you're interested. So the Heath brothers, who wrote the book, came up with a really simple framework that helps you understand how to say what you're saying in a way that the people who are listening will hear it. They use simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotion, and story, which misspells success, but is success without an extra S on the end, or a needed S. They use this framework to help you think about how to take that data and make it palatable to the person who's hearing it. I'm going to give you a really brief definition of those. When we think of simple, we think about stripping something to its core. What is at the absolute core of the message that you're trying to get across? Unexpected, something that generates curiosity or interest from the person who's hearing it. Concrete, how do you frame that data at human scale? It's visual. It makes you think of tasting, touching, smelling. Credible. Is it testable? Does it fit with what I know about the world? That can be true by having an authority give information, right? But it can also be true if I can look at it and say, oh yeah, yep, that fits with what I know. Emotion, provoking feelings, and then stories, which illustrate relationships. I'm giving you some detail at the bottom, just some of the examples that I use to get to some of the metrics that I'm going to share with you. So lots of times when I get a new grant writer, we're just going to talk about grants for a moment. Data's a thing in grants. They want real information. They don't just want to know that you're doing some good. They want to know how much good you're doing and when you're doing it, how you're doing it. So we collect a lot of data. What beginning grant writers tend to do with that data is this, and I'm going to read this because it's a great example. Agency A, not to be named, provided 10,000 pounds of food last year, including 200 emergency boxes, 400 congregate meals, and pantry operations, while open 2 days a week for 3 hours. We served 350 unduplicated community members, 15% of which identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color, or Latino, Latina, most of whom were served by our agency through at least 3 site visits. You want to listen to more of that? No. And do you remember anything? Any one of those numbers? No. There's way, way, way too much information there. So when we think about being simple, I took all that, and if my goal is to identify in the community what I do, out of all of those pieces of data that I collected, for me, the most simple piece that is the core of that is that we delivered 10,000 pounds of food assistance. If I'm thinking about the success framework, how do I make that more concrete? Well, food assistance is not something that you picture in your head every day, but meals are. sorry, getting excited, moving my mic around. Meals are something that you do every day, right? When I think of concrete, I also think of making numbers smaller and rounder. They're simpler. They don't distract from what you're trying to say. If you need accuracy, use it. If you don't need accuracy, give yourself and your reader a break and let them see a round number. So we've made it more concrete. How do we add some of those other things? Well, 10,000 pounds of food assistance feeds about 25 people a meal each day for a year. If I did my math right, which I might not have because I'm not a math girl. But which is more compelling to somebody reading? 10,000 pounds of food assistance, 8,333 meals, or we fed about the equivalent of 25 people a meal each day for a year. Which one can you wrap your head around? All of us are buying groceries, right? Volunteer hours, same thing. We had 4,160 volunteer hours. If this is an organization who has a goal of illustrating and encouraging community engagement, volunteer hours is probably a good metric to use. Not a bad choice. How do we make that more concrete? Well, the average person probably doesn't write grants, so they probably don't write all the time that 280 hours is equivalent to a full-time job for a year. But everybody understands what a full-time job is, right? You all understand what like double full-time job is probably because of the work that you're doing. So saying it's the equivalent of 2 FTEs is real clear, okay? Or $126,000 worth of value, that's real clear. We'd all like to have $126,000. That number, by the way, comes from the independent sector, which every year releases the value of volunteer time. This year it's $30.30 per hour. $30.30 per hour. They usually release it each April. You can look at, just Google independent sector and it'll pop right up, okay? So how do we add more to that? We've got something simple, we've translated it into something concrete. Here's a couple ideas. Each volunteer hour offsets the cost to put dinner on 50 plates. So not only do we get the help that you give us when you're volunteering, but the money that we would have had to spend on staff, that's providing 50 more meals too. Or last year, volunteers donated enough time to do work equivalent to 2 full-time employees. Or maybe it's a half-time employee. It doesn't matter. But find a way to make it relevant to your organization. It could be days of volunteer time. Days is more understandable than hours in terms of value. Okay, so it doesn't have to be 2 FTEs. How about your annual budget? $100,000. I used 0.53 as the cost of delivering a pound of food, which is, by the way, a really good metric for you to have, taking your annual costs and dividing it by the pounds you deliver to get yourself a real round number for what it costs you to deliver a pound of food on average. Any pound, that spreads your cost over in-kind and food that you pay for, right? But it's all inclusive. If you take what you spent last year and divide it by the number of pounds that you delivered, you have a really good measure of what it takes you to acquire, warehouse or store, and deliver that food. Okay? So I think 188,679 pounds is more concrete than a $100,000 annual budget. Still a big number. So can we translate that? Well, at 53 cents a pound, one donated dollar buys 1.9 pounds of food. $1 that you give to me at the food bank goes 6 times further than you going to the grocery store and spending that dollar on something that you give to me at the food bank. I had no idea. 6 times. Feed America says $3.77 per meal. Why would I ever intentionally go to the grocery store and buy a retail piece of food when I could give you $1 and have it go 6 times as far? It's real good information for people to have, but it's not something that they get from a $100,000 budget or 188,000 pounds. All of those things on the right are simple. They're as concrete as we can make them. And we've wrapped in some of those other pieces. Some things are unexpected. I think it's unexpected. It was unexpected for me that $1 would go 6 times further at the food bank. Okay? I didn't understand that. I can understand, I can use credible opportunity to test a theory in my mind and say, last year, did volunteers donate enough time to do work equivalent to 2 full-time employees? Is that possible? Okay, well, they had 4,000 hours. Yeah, it adds up, right? Check it against what I know about the world. Emotion, anytime you add people, anytime you add strong verbs like feeding instead of providing food. And story are those relationships. And you'll notice in each one of those, there's a relationship. So me taking all of that stuff that I read you in that initial paragraph and instead saying, we delivered enough pounds to feed the equivalent of 25 people a meal each day for a year, that they will remember. Does anybody remember anything other than 10,000 pounds, which I'm continuing to mention? From what I read originally? No. Okay? So, how are we?
Just about at time.
About at time. Okay. So, let me see. Oh, we're about at the end, too. So you'll get this, and you can think about it. We won't go through it today because I'd rather give you time for questions. But I was just going to have you, if we had time, take an example and try to do it yourself. How do you make those things more concrete? How do you turn them into a story? How do you add emotion or unexpectedness to them so that people read it or hear it and remember it? Okay? So ask yourself if the data is useful, and think about it in terms of the ecosystem, not just in terms of the dollar or the report. Are you collecting the right data, the metrics? Are you collecting it consistently, the methods? Are you evaluating for progress, the analysis? And are you using that as energy for the ecosystem application? Does it share the value of your work when we're talking about storytelling? Does it share the value of your work and motivate action? Are you at the core of your message? Simple and concrete. Is it at human scale and relatable? Credible in story? And is it interesting and engaging? Unexpected emotion. Okay. When I say human scale, I'm going to give you one more example and then we'll do questions. When we were going to go through that, I had 20% of kids on there. 20% does not really give you a picture. You might have a pie chart in your head. But if you say 1 in 5 kids are hungry, better yet, 1 in 5 kids that you pass on the street in your town don't have enough food, You're saying something that people are going to remember and that is going to add an understanding of the value of your work for the community. That's how you use data. That's why data helps you. It helps you in that ecosystem and every part of that ecosystem. And if you're doing those things, you're doing what you need to do to get grants. You're already doing it, okay? All right, questions? And you guys have snack after too, right? So I'd be running out of here. Don't feel bad running out of here. Cookies and milk sound better than talking about data for more. Any questions? Okay.
Volunteers aren't like you. I mean, I can't relate to the data, but you have the numbers. I don't have the numbers in my head. I mean, we need people like you. And we really do, focus and do it for the message. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah, if you enjoyed it, seriously, the Made to Stick book, I don't know if you can get it on Kindle. It's fun. It's an easy read. They give tons of examples, and some of them are a little outdated at this point, but it is fantastic. I used it when I taught nonprofit communications in college, and it was a great read and also a book that I go back to. If I look at my stack, it's the one that's the most messed up. Annette?
Not that we want to hold up people from cookies, but can you speak to very quickly the importance of parallel data and attribution when you're using data to tell stories?
Okay, so talking about data that is, so she said parallel data and attribution, right? Where did you get the data? What source are you using? And if we flipped back a couple slides, you would see at the bottom where I had information about where I got the numbers that I was using. Share that information. You can do it in a footnote. You can do it in a narrative, right? But if you're using data from somewhere else to arrive at the information that you're providing, tell people where you got it, right? Parallel, compare apples to apples, right? Compare apples to apples. It's important that when your volunteers are asking for data, that they're asking the same question, or your data is not going to be reliable, okay? It's important when you make comparisons that you're comparing the same thing. You're not saying, oh, we're a workforce development organization and our graduation rate is 90%, 98% for kids who are at risk compared to 90% for the state of Iowa. Okay, yeah, but yours is over 5 years and theirs is over 4, right? You can't compare those two things. So make sure that when you're looking at data and you're using the comparative value for you year over year, internally or externally, that you're comparing apples to apples. And there are times when you can't. And again, COVID's a perfect example. I have never written more grant applications with asterisks in them. This is unusual. This is not expected. We cannot use these numbers from 2020, 2021 to make a good guess about what happens going forward. And when we try to make a good guess and we think things are going to be really difficult and we're going to have to give a lot of food and then the government gives a lot of assistance, it doesn't look how we thought. And when they're giving a lot of assistance and we don't have to supply a lot of food because people have what they need and then the government takes that away, it changes, right? So when you're doing those comparisons, analysis is understanding in part where you came from and that there are things that, information that was generated in the same way for it to be useful. Otherwise, it's just data. Do you want to add anything? No? Is that good? Anything else? Cookies? I'll be here for a few minutes, so if you want to chat, feel free to come up. Thanks, you guys.